Hello and welcome to the module on food selection. Once again, big credit to Gavin Aquilina for really jazzing up these titles of the modules. It's really a gift he's gotten. So, lesson one, we'll look at a brief history of public health dietary guidelines to kind of get some footing on how things have evolved and how things have changed and not really changed. Then we'll move on to an overview of the food groups. Then we'll look at protein-rich foods and fats, and then fibrous vegetables and starch foods, and then milk and milk products, and fruit. And then we will wrap things up with IIFYM and a concept called discretionary calorie allotment. And we'll look at the history on those things. And so by the time we're done with this module, you will have an understanding of dietary guidelines as they relate to public health. And you'll also have an understanding of foods and the food groups. So without risking too bad of a pun here, we're really getting to the meat of nutrition with this module. And that is a dad joke. Okay, so let's look at a brief history of public health dietary guidelines. Little walk down memory lane here. Government issued nutritional guidelines date back to 1916, at least in the US. And this began with the Caroline Hunt Buying Guide, which was followed by the Basic 7 Foundation Diet in the 1940s. And then we have the more famous and the most culturally significant guidelines. They began in 1956. This was the Basic 4 food groups. So everybody, at least as of at least a couple generations back and further, we know about the 4 food groups. The Basic 4 consisting of meat, the meat group, the milk group, the fruit and vegetable group, and then the bread and cereal group. So those were the Basic 4 that were put forth in the 1950s. And it wasn't until 1992 that the iconic food guide pyramid was put out. And this was a joint production by the USDA, so the US Department of Agriculture, and the US Department of Health and Human Services. So the pyramid, and this was a very long-standing publication. So we're looking at a 13-year tenure that this graphic was floating around the public domain. And it still is one of the most widely distributed and recognizable nutrition education tools developed in the United States. And almost everybody has seen it. And almost just as many people have criticized it and complained about it, with some justification. Speaking of criticizing the pyramid, let's do just that. So the recommendation of 6 to 11 servings of grains and grain products at the base of the pyramid is what has drawn the bulk of the criticism from folks who blame the pyramid for the obesity epidemic and the epidemic of diabetes and even heart disease and even the so-called syndrome of diabesity, sort of this combination of obesity and diabetes. I don't completely disagree with that. It doesn't make immediate sense to predominate the diet with refined and engineered foods as depicted at the base of the pyramid there. You're just seeing a whole lot of flour foods. Some incarnations of the pyramid have a potato or two at the bottom of the pyramid, but this original incarnation puts potato up there in the vegetable group. But this was the graphic that was put out to the public in 1992 and stayed out with the public until 2003. The 6 to 11 servings seems kind of shockingly large, but not so much when you realize that each serving represents about 15 to 20 grams of carbohydrate. So it's not staggeringly large, but just the fact that we're looking at the bulk of your food servings coming from. Essentially, refined and engineered flour foods is not ideal. And the whole grain issue is really an interesting one, which we'll take a little bit closer look at when we look at grains as a subset of the starch food group. And I like to bring up the example of goldfish crackers because they have a whole grain version of goldfish crackers. And it's obviously not an in quotes health food. And it can be, it can function as a junk food, as not necessarily empty calories, but frivolous calories. So a healthier remodeling of the starch category would be a roughly even proportion of grains, tubers, and legumes. Legumes is the umbrella term for foods within the Fabaceae family. And a little bit more accurate would be to call beans and peas and lentils, it would be more accurate to call them pulses because legumes are referring to the whole plant, like the leaves, the stems, the stalks, and um, all of that stuff that we and the pods and the stuff that do not necessarily are not necessarily being referred to when we talk about beans and peas. Those are actually pulses under the umbrella of legumes, which is referring to the Fabaceae family. But botanically speaking, okay, so not going too far on that side note. Grouping nuts together with meat there at the top is kind of silly. Yes, there is protein in nuts, but nuts are about 80% fat. So, from a nutritional standpoint, it just makes more sense to group nuts in the fats and oils category. And so the pyramid doesn't do that. And so we can definitely nitpick at it, and it's definitely imperfect. And unfortunately, as a public health signal, it didn't really work. So, fats, oils, and sweets are grouped together in a category that visually projects a message to minimize intake. The use sparingly message might be fine for added sugars and ultra processed dessert and snack foods, but a substantial body of evidence points to an array of health benefits from various fat rich foods, including fatty fish and fish oil and nuts and seeds and extra virgin oil and avocado. So the pyramid has a disproportionately low protein recommendation. This has been a problem for many decades now. So the pyramid's recommendations are based on the recommended dietary allowance of protein, which is too low at 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. It's roughly in the mid 40s to mid 50 grams total for the day for an average sized person. And so this is too low to support optimal health, optimal body composition, and it's too low to support physical activity and performance and just everything that really counts for health and fitness. So another point I want to make, it's important to remember, as much as the pyramid can be criticized, the general public failed to follow the guidelines. So the majority of the public overconsumed added fats, added sugars, alcoholic beverages, and the public also underconsumed the recommended amounts of the nutrient-rich food groups, except for the protein and meat group and grains. So the USDA set the bar really low for protein servings, and so people exceeded that. And with grains, they set it high, but people still exceeded that. So the general public didn't properly follow the prescribed public health guidelines that the pyramid projected anyway. And that is a problem with the pyramid. You can have a perfect set of guidelines, which the pyramid obviously wasn't, but if for one reason or another the public cannot seem to follow it, then you got a problem. So here are the successors to the food guide pyramid. So when the pyramid was retired, my plate, or rather my pyramid, replaced it. And so my pyramid was sort of this stylized version of the food guide pyramid that was originally intended to try to simplify things and try to sort of unconfuse people, because the idea was that that graphic with the pyramid just wasn't getting the message across. And so here we have my pyramid, introduced in 2005, and it included some vague symbolism of physical activity and also conveyed a more balanced picture of the food groups that's shown by these, somewhat vertical sections of the pyramid graphic. But this graphic was just too abstract, not explicit enough for the public to comprehend. It also required the public to take the extra step of digging into the pyramid's associated literature and links, and it required a bunch of reading. And the literature explained the food groups and serving sizes, and apparently this digging and reading into the links was just not feasible. So these issues likely led to my pyramid's significantly shorter lifespan, which was 6 years compared to the food guide pyramid's 13-year tenure. And what replaced my pyramid was a graphic called My Plate. And this was put out in 2011. And so it was put out because the general public could not wrap its head around the previous pyramid models, and it just couldn't implement them. So My Plate currently remains the model of public health. Can we criticize it? Yeah, we can. Is it potentially better and more effective than the previous incarnations of the public health nutrition guidelines? Not necessarily. It was put out in 2011. Here we are at 2024, going on 2025. And heart disease and diabetes is still going up. And we still have a lot of issues on the public health front with metabolic disease. So I would say it is an improvement in terms of simplicity and explicitness, but something isn't quite getting through. And it might not necessarily be at the level of the graphic itself. It might be at the level of how effectively nutrition and health professionals can battle rampant misinformation. And apparently we're losing that battle, because even with a relatively simple public health message that My Plate puts out, we're still seeing diet-related chronic diseases go up. Well, that's the overview of the public health nutrition guidelines, and I will see you back on lesson 2, where we look at an overview of the food groups.